Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Rising Storm 2 Vietnam for PC. It's a sequel to the previous Rising Storm game, which was actually a standalone expansion pack for Red Orchestra 2 Heroes of Stalingrad, and it shares a lot in common with, of course, Rising Storm, as well as Red Orchestra 2. Except unlike the previous games in the series, this isn't set in World War II, it's set during the Vietnam War, which means that they are braving what I like to call the Vietnam Curse. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that prior to the release of this game, pretty much every single Vietnam War game that came out was either mediocre or downright terrible. Vietnam was a confusing disaster of a conflict, and turning that into a video game is not remotely easy, as those previous games have shown. About the closest the entire games industry has managed to a decent Vietnam War shooter is the game Viet Cong, and that game was really not good either. Which of course brings up the major question. Did Rising Storm 2 manage to weather the storm and actually get past the curse, or did it just fall into the same rut as the other games? Well, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, I don't have to do the brown and gray and realistic gag for this one because it's not all brown and gray. In fact, it has quite a bit of color in it, which is greatly appreciated. Now granted, there is still a lot of brown, there is still a lot of green, because it is a jungle environment for the most part, and on one particular map it's been basically burnt to a crisp, so it makes sense for those. But in some of the other maps where you have more opportunities for color, they actually do go ahead and put more color in. This really does help the aesthetics out quite a bit, because visually this game is really not all that impressive. Oh, don't get me wrong, the modeling is actually very well done, the texture quality is pretty solid, the animations themselves are generally fairly smooth and fluid, except for a few instances here and there. And the environments themselves actually are pretty packed with detail, which is very nice. But when I say it's not really impressive looking, I mean that it's running on Unreal Engine 3, and thus it's just not looking up to the most current standards of the industry. Now, to be fair, the developers were not working on a AAA production scale, nor were they working on a AAA budget. And given those constraints, they've done an extremely good job with the visuals, it's just that, like I said, they're really not all that impressive, and sometimes they do look a bit dated. Now, of course, there are a few visual glitches here and there that don't really help things out, such as the visual pop-in that you see from time to time where it'll just flash briefly for a second before it actually loads everything in. Or the glitch where if you look down into the squad tunnels, you find that it's actually not textured or anything, and it ends up just kind of going to the end of the map dimensions. But those are just mild annoyances more than anything else. And I'm sure that given time, those can be fixed up. What may be a bit more problematic is the sound design. Now, that's not to say the sound design is bad. In fact, overall, it's quite solid. It's just that the gun sounds are not particularly good. Now, they don't sound like pea shooters either for the most part, but they just don't have enough punch to them. They're not beefy enough, and that really does make using them slightly less enjoyable. Especially since most of the weapons have a pretty powerful effect on target, and most enemies will go down in 1 or 2 hits. Unless they got lucky and you just grazed them anyway. Now, the explosions are certainly a bit better, particularly the artillery fire, but when you get down to it, they just need more bass to them. They need more beef. As it stands, the only rattling effect you get from the artillery barrages, for example, is the fact that your screen will go all blurry because this game still has the suppression effect from the previous Red Orchestra game. So more bass would definitely help rattle you around a lot more with the artillery fire and make it definitely a lot more intimidating. But it's not all about gun and explosion sounds, it's also about the music, where they do have a licensed track in there, which is Run Through the Jungle by CCR. That's Creedence Clearwater Revival for all of you people out there who only listen to dubstep and have no idea what actual music is. And beyond that, they do have some ambient tracks that fit in pretty well with the theme, but the thing is, I usually turn the music off when I'm playing anyway because I'm more focused on the actual audio of the battle going on rather than the music. Now keep in mind, that's not me bad-mouthing the soundtrack or anything. The soundtrack itself is actually pretty solid, it's just that the kind of game Rising Storm 2 is necessitates listening primarily to the game audio and not to the music. Because you're going to be far more worried about communicating with your teammates and avoiding incoming fire and listening for enemies being around you rather than actually going, hey, this is a pretty good song, I'm going to jam out now. And speaking of communication, there is quite a bit of battle chatter in this game. Now, if you're playing on the Vietnamese side, they all speak Vietnamese, and if you're playing on the American side, obviously they all speak English. And the battle chatter mostly consists of things like calling out where you're spotting enemies if you're actually using the spotting mechanics anyway, as well as being like, hey, I'm under fire, or starting to actually freak out because you're under suppression effects and you're being shot at and such. And it does all work pretty well, although I will say that even though I don't speak Vietnamese, the Vietnamese voice acting seems a bit stilted. And the announcer for that team almost sounds like a caricature. The accent is so ridiculously thick, so that doesn't help. But overall, apart from the occasional cheesy line from one of the American GIs, the game actually has pretty decent voice acting for what they're trying to go for. But of course what really matter here are the story, or rather lack thereof, and the gameplay. The story is nothing more than you are a soldier fighting in the Vietnam War. There is no single-player campaign, or really single-player at all for that matter, beyond a simple shooting range that you can go to test out the various weapons and the various classes and see which ones you like. This means that it falls to the multiplayer gameplay to bring things up, and that's where this game both shines and falters a bit. There are 3 modes available in the game at launch. The first of these is Territories, the second is Supremacy, and the third is called Skirmish. In the Territories mode, one team defends 2 points and the other team attacks those 2 points. Once they capture those 2 points, it falls back to the next line of points. Your team has a limited number of respawns available until no reinforcements will be able to respawn, so you do have to work together with your team to maximize your effect on the enemy as well as minimize the damage that they can do to you. Obviously, the defending team's objective is basically to deplete the enemy's ability to respawn or hold the points long enough that the enemy has to capture one or they lose within a short time frame. That time frame is usually 2 to 3 minutes depending on the server settings. And while I'm not sure if they're going to change this with subsequent map releases, the current state of affairs is that the Vietnamese are always defending and the Americans are always on offense. Now, of course, the thing is that the Vietnamese team is inherently suited to defending just by what abilities they're given, whereas the American team is more suited to offense. But I'm definitely not going to write off the entire possibility of maybe a map or two eventually being released that has the Americans on defense. We just don't know right now. Now, of course, that goes out the window with the Supremacy and the Skirmish modes, because Skirmish is basically a 3-point domination mode, and then Supremacy is a lot like the Conquest mode from the Battlefield series, where you have a lot of points on a really big map, and you try to capture them in a sort of succession. The thing is that the points actually are linked together, so you don't want the chain to get broken, because then points become a problem. Skirmish mode, on the other hand, is a fairly simple mode that's for a considerably lower number of players. You've got 16 players on that particular mode. And of course it takes place on much smaller maps that are a lot more conducive to a 3-point domination mode. Now, in that mode, they try to force you to capture different points in order to prevent the lockout timer from preventing your team from respawning, while of course trying to capture as many points as possible to prevent the enemy from being able to respawn as well. Unlike the other 2 modes, it's meant for pretty quick play sessions, and you don't really see a whole lot of servers actually running that mode. Most servers run the other 2 modes with a particular emphasis on territories. And that's probably because there's at least a bit more variety with the Territories mode than there is for the Supremacy mode, because even though the Supremacy mode is certainly interesting and it takes place on very large maps with a lot of opportunities for different tactical maneuvers, it only has 2 maps. Meaning that it becomes extremely samey extremely quickly, and on top of that, it is very easy to get absolutely steamrolled in the Supremacy mode. Now, of course, you can be steamrolled in the other 2 modes as well, but it's a bit less likely because the maps are a bit more confined and you know more what to expect from them. Meanwhile, in the Supremacy mode, it's basically just a free-for-all for whichever points you can actually capture, and you're not entirely sure who's going to pop up where and when. Meaning your team needs to be extremely coordinated to be able to pull off a Supremacy victory. And unfortunately, that's probably just not going to happen if you're playing with a bunch of randos. Which in turn makes the Supremacy mode a lot more frustrating than anything else because you do need such a high level of teamwork in order to actually win it. That, or the enemy team just has to be that much worse than you. That, coupled with the fact that there are only 2 maps for it, means that the Supremacy mode really does not have very much longevity to it. That could certainly improve with later map releases, but in its current state, the Supremacy mode ends up being a liability more than an asset. The Skirmish mode, on the other hand, feels like a concession made to try to appease people who weren't used to the Red Orchestra playstyle. As I said before, it has a much smaller player count and the maps are considerably more confined, meaning you get a lot of CQB action and it tends to play very quickly. And while it certainly can be fun for a short period of time, it's not the kind of thing that you're going to want to play for hours and hours and hours on end because the level of teamwork required for it is considerably lower than the other 2 modes. meaning that the skirmish mode ends up not really fitting in all that well with the other modes and not really fitting in with the general play style of Red Orchestra or Rising Storm. Now sure, it's not like they put in a TDM or an FFA mode, but when you get to the skirmish mode and you find it's basically just domination with a slight twist, it ends up losing its luster pretty quickly, especially when you find out that it only has 3 maps. You should be sensing a pattern here at this point. Well, last but not least is the Territories mode, which is the real meat of the game and is clearly where they put the most effort. It is the most played mode in the game, as well as having the best maps in the game. And like the Supremacy mode, it still requires a lot of teamwork in order to be able to achieve victory. The main difference being that since you're not having to spread yourself way too thin over all of the different points on the map and only have to focus on 2 points, well, sometimes only 1 point, it's actually a lot more doable with random players because you don't have to have the pinpoint level of precision that Supremacy mode all but requires. As long as your overall teamwork is strong and your overall strategy is strong, generally speaking, you can come out on top of a Territories match, even if you're not playing particularly well. There is still a pretty major problem with that mode though. It only has 3 maps. You heard me right, this game only has 8 maps in total, 3 of which are blocked off to the Territories mode, 3 of them are blocked off to the Skirmish mode, and 2 of them are blocked off to the Supremacy mode. To put it simply, there are nowhere near enough maps in Rising Storm 2 Vietnam. Now I'm sure they will eventually add more maps to the game, but in its current state, there's only 8 of them in total, and it's 3 for 2 of the modes and 2 for 1 of the modes. The lack of variety in the maps means that it becomes very samey very quickly, which is actually a real shame because the core gameplay itself is actually very solid. This plays a lot like Red Orchestra 2, or more specifically Rising Storm, which means that you have 2 somewhat asymmetrical sides, one of them being the US and the other one being the Vietnamese, each of which does have a somewhat different playstyle than the other. The Americans, for example, are much bigger on offense, whereas the Vietnamese are set up to be really defensive. For example, they can place squad tunnels closer to where the points are so that their squad can spawn at that particular point and then be able to rush directly into the battle to replenish the line, as opposed to having to go all the way from the spawn to wherever the position on the map is. Then of course there's the matter of they get punji traps as well as tripwires that will allow them to seal off an area and make it very difficult for the enemy to advance. Thing is, even though they have those advantages, they don't have any vehicles, and the Americans get helicopters. Now the Vietnamese do get anti-air defenses, but they need their commander to deploy those, so it becomes a bit moot if their commander is not doing their job. Of course, it's also moot if the pilots for those helicopters have no idea what they're doing and end up crashing into the ground almost immediately after taking off. Being a decent helicopter pilot in this game definitely takes some skill, and it's something that not all that many people who actually hop into the role are actually good at. Of course, that's assuming that the helicopters are even available in the first place, because on certain maps they are actually not available. Thing is that even though the helicopters do provide you a bit of an advantage, they don't really provide enough of an advantage to where it breaks the game or anything to not have them. You can manage just fine with a team of nothing but infantry as long as you are working together as a team, because that's what it really requires. This is a class-based game, and each class does have its own specific role in addition to having its own selection of weapons. If you play as a scout, you better be prepared to spot enemies and lay down smoke cover for your team. Similarly, if you play a radio man, you better be right next to your commander at all times so they can just radio in artillery strikes and napalm strikes and things like that without having to run all the way back to the base. And if you're a machine gunner, you better be laying down suppressive fire and not just running in guns blazing like Rambo. You have to be communicating with your team at all times in order to ensure that the enemy does not manage to flank you and does not manage to get anybody on the position to actually overtake it, or to make sure that you actually get to that position to overtake it. Because gaining ground in this game does require concerted effort from your team, particularly considering that the time to kill is so ridiculously low in this. The damage modeling in this is rather realistic, which means that most of the time you will go down in 1 or 2 hits, sometimes 3 or 4 if you get really lucky and they manage to graze you. Like Red Orchestra and Rising Storm before it, it also has the free aim mechanic, where when you aren't aiming down your sights, you can just move the gun freely around the screen in addition to looking left, right, up, and down. Now, unlike Red Orchestra 2, it doesn't default to having free aim with the iron sights, although that is something you can enable as well. Instead, the default is to center your aim whenever you aim down your sights. They did retain the sight adjustment feature from Red Orchestra 2 as well, where you can actually adjust the length of your iron sights in order to be able to aim at longer distances. Now, I find that feature kind of useless because you can just as easily learn to lead your shots in order to actually be able to hit something at a different distance. But it does bring up the fact that, like its predecessors, this game does have pretty realistic ballistics. Bullets do not travel in a straight laser-like line like you're used to from, say, Call of Duty. Instead, they do actually follow an arc that means that if you're firing at a distant target, you're going to have to aim higher in order to hit it. At least if your gun is actually capable of reaching out that far to begin with. But regardless of what you're using, the weapon handling in this game is actually rather good for the most part. While some of the weapons don't really have all that much recoil, others actually have quite a lot of it. And particularly if you're firing in full auto, you need to put it in short controlled bursts rather than just letting loose, otherwise you're going to run out of ammo really quickly and not hit anything. Of course, the notable exception there is the LMGs, where you're supposed to be letting out long streams of fire anyway. Thing is, you need to be careful with those because if you keep firing, your barrel will actually heat up and eventually warp, which completely ruins the accuracy. Of course, even with the LMGs, accuracy is actually very important in this game because most of your engagements are going to take place at mid to long range. At least until you get up to the point in which case you'll probably be engaging in a lot of CQB. But at least at medium and long ranges, accuracy is king, because if you can get your shots landed accurately before the enemy can hit you, then you've guaranteed that the enemy loses a respawn ticket and you get to live to fight another day. This encourages playing the game pretty slowly and methodically, peeking out from cover and taking a few shots before advancing to the next bit of cover. Even laying down suppressive fire is a very good idea, unlike in some other first-person shooters, because then it engages the suppression effect, which makes the screen go very, very blurry and you start having a much higher heart rate, which in turn means that you're going to be a lot less accurate. It's really annoying to be on the receiving end of, but if you're the one dishing it out, it is a lifesaver for your team. And if you're taking your time with your shots and making every single one of them count, even if it's just suppressive fire, and if you're firing and advancing as a team, while all communicating constantly to make sure that everyone is up to speed on everything, in addition to making sure you communicate with the team's commander who can actually call in artillery strikes and napalm strikes on the marks that the squad leaders can put out with purple smoke grenades, then you'll find that for the most part, the game actually ends up being a pretty fantastic multiplayer experience. The problems start to come in a couple of major arenas, the first of them being the player base itself. If you're in a game with a bunch of random players who have no idea what they're doing, then you're probably going to have a really bad time because they're not going to be communicating very well, they're not going to be working together as a team, and ultimately you're probably going to end up losing the match. But if you're playing with an experienced Rising Storm and Red Orchestra team, people who've been playing this series for a long time and really know the ins and outs of it, then you're probably going to have a fantastic time because they'll know what they're doing and they will actually be able to help you along. Because I think most veterans of the series understand completely that it's a very different style of first-person shooter than what most people are used to, and it takes a lot of getting adjusted to before you can be comfortable with it. And if you have those experienced players taking on the roles that are more for a leadership position, like the squad leaders as well as the commander, then they should be able to help you out by actually giving the squad objectives and making sure that everybody's spawning on the squad leader if you're on the American side, or spawning in the squad tunnel if you're on the Vietnamese side, while of course also marking targets for airstrikes and such like that. Whereas someone who doesn't really know what they're doing playing that role will probably just end up running around like a headless chicken until they get mowed down from machine gun fire. So that means that the major problem of the community can be really hit or miss depending on the team makeup, whether or not they're established veterans or whether they are new players who have no idea what they're doing, and that leads to a wild variance in your actual gameplay enjoyment. But the other major issue that you'll run into is just technical problems, things like occasional lag spikes even though this thing does run with dedicated servers, things like hit registration occasionally messing up, not all the time, but sometimes you'll aim at a target and you'll actually hit below where you were actually aiming, which gets kind of annoying. Because while that sort of thing is perfectly fine at longer ranges, it shouldn't be happening to you when you're near point blank, which it often does. The thing is that, unlike a lot of developers, the Tripwire devs actually do play their own game to help get feedback for how they can improve it, and they have actually already acknowledged that the hit registration has some issues and they will be working on it. They've also acknowledged that there are performance issues that are present for some people that they are working on as well. Now, I didn't run into any performance problems, but then again, I'm running a pretty powerful PC. It's a GTX 970, 16 gigs of RAM, and an i7 4790K. That's still a pretty powerful PC, even though it's not top of the line anymore. And like I said, I didn't really notice any major issues. It mostly ran at 60 plus frames a second all the time, although I did have occasional hitching here and there when it tried to load some things in. But of course, your mileage may vary on that. But despite the technical issues, which I have no doubt will be patched up in the future, and the actual issues with the player base, there's really not a lot that's outright wrong with the game other than the fact that it lacks a single-player campaign at all, which probably is a good thing given the history of the series with regards to single-player campaigns. And the fact that there are so few maps in it right now, which again I'm pretty sure will eventually be fixed. Which means that despite its issues, this is actually the best Vietnam War first-person shooter out there right now. Of course, that doesn't really mean much considering that every Vietnam War shooter out there was either mediocre or downright crap before this, so it's not exactly a huge bar to clear. But it is still a bar that had to be cleared, and they actually did it pretty well, at least in a multiplayer context. I have no idea how a single-player version of this game would be and if it would handle single-player well or not. But if you're looking for a really solid first-person shooter set in the Vietnam War, and you are okay with the learning curve and the tactical nature of Rising Storm, then you will definitely be able to enjoy this. And it's almost certainly only going to get better as they patch the game up and fix all the technical problems and add more content later on down the line. Of course, the thing is, this is still a niche game. It's a tactical shooter, and it's of the Red Orchestra style, which means that it's not going to appeal to everyone out there. Not everyone is big on the slow-paced, methodical, low-time-to-kill shooters. The thing is, I would still recommend this to a newcomer to that particular genre because it is more accessible than something like Red Orchestra. Especially considering that it doesn't have the major problem that Red Orchestra 2 did, where you would level up your guns constantly and eventually you'd get better and better attachments for them that just made them flat out better than the base versions. In this one, you don't have to worry about that. All of the level-based unlocks, every single one, is purely cosmetic. It's all there to just change the way your soldier looks, not the way you actually play. And I both greatly appreciate the fact that they put in soldier customization and the fact that they limited all of the level-based unlocks to just cosmetic items and nothing more. Now that said, it still does take a really long time to actually level up and unlock those things, and I would rather there not really be a progression system like that in the game at all, but it's certainly not a deal breaker. Of course, the thing is that in its current state, it does still need quite a bit of work to really reach its full potential, and as a result, I'm giving it a 3.5 out of 5. They've still done an excellent job with this thing, it's just that they definitely need to get more content in there and they need to sort out the technical problems before they can really start to achieve the greatness that this game actually has potential to be. But the thing is, the price is actually right on this one, because it's $25 at its base price right now, and I feel like that's actually pretty fair for something that, even though it doesn't have a huge amount of content right now, is as actually good as it is. Now, I'll most likely revisit this review later on down the line when they've done more patching and they've added more content in to see how it holds up, but for now, we finally have a good Vietnam War shooter out there, even if it is a niche game. Thanks for watching.